The autumn mist was still clinging to the Yorkshire countryside when the letter arrived that would change everything I thought I knew about my life. I am Aldwin Ravenshollow, 28 years old, and until that morning in November of 1794, I believed I understood my place in the world. As the newly inherited Earl of Ravenshollow, I had expected many burdens to fall upon my shoulders after my father's death, but nothing could have prepared me for what my mother was about to demand of me. I was sitting in the breakfast room, watching the golden light filter through the tall Georgian windows of our manor, when she swept in with that particular expression I had learned to dread since childhood. Lady Margaret Ravenshollow had always been a formidable woman, but grief and financial worry had sharpened her features into something almost severe. She placed a folded document on the polished mahogany table beside my morning tea, her pale hands trembling slightly as she withdrew them. The sight of that tremor sent an unexpected chill through me, because my mother had never shown weakness, not even at my father's funeral. "Aldwin," she said, her voice carrying that tone of absolute authority I remembered from my youth, "you will be married within the month." I nearly choked on my tea. Setting down the delicate porcelain cup, I looked up at her with what I hoped was calm composure, though my heart had begun racing. "Mother, surely this is rather sudden. I know there have been discussions about suitable matches, but—" "There are no discussions," she interrupted, her steel-gray eyes fixing on mine with unwavering determination. "The arrangements have been made. The banns will be read this Sunday." My hands moved to the document, unfolding it with growing unease. As I read the formal language of what appeared to be a marriage contract, my confusion deepened into something approaching shock. This wasn't an arrangement with Lord Pemberton's daughter, as I had long expected. This wasn't an alliance with any of the prominent families of our acquaintance. Celeste Thornwick, I read aloud, the name feeling foreign on my tongue. "Mother, I don't understand. Who is Celeste Thornwick?" For just a moment, something flickered across my mother's face that might have been pain, quickly replaced by her usual mask of stern resolve. She moved to the window, her black mourning dress rustling against the silence of the morning. "She has served this family faithfully for 20 years, she said without turning around. "She has proven herself to be loyal, intelligent, and of good moral character. In these uncertain times, Aldwin, such qualities are worth more than a dowry." The realization hit me like a physical blow. "You mean, the maid? You're asking me to marry our maid?" "I am not asking," my mother replied, finally turning to face me. "I am telling you what will happen. The estate is in grave financial difficulty, more severe than you know. This marriage will solve several problems at once." I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Mother, this is impossible. I cannot marry a servant. The social implications alone would ruin us. What would society say? What would our peers think?" "Our peers," she said with bitter emphasis, "will think what they choose to think regardless of our actions. But they will not think it while we are destitute and homeless. This marriage is not a request, Aldwin. It is a necessity." I began pacing before the fireplace, my mind racing through the implications. Celeste Thornwick. I had known her, of course, for as long as I could remember. She had been part of the household since I was a boy of 8, arriving as a quiet child of 6 to work in the kitchens. Over the years, she had risen through the ranks of our small household staff, eventually becoming my mother's personal maid and the unofficial head of the domestic servants. She was. I struggled to organize my thoughts about her. Intelligent, certainly. I had often noticed her reading when she thought no one was watching, and she spoke with a refinement that seemed unusual for someone of her station. She was also beautiful, though she took great care to dress and carry herself modestly. Her auburn hair was always properly covered, her green eyes downcast in the presence of family members, her manner quietly efficient. But she was a maid. The daughter of no one, with no family name, no dowry, no social connections. The idea of marrying her seemed not just impractical, but impossible. "There must be another way," I said finally. Surely we could arrange a loan, or find some other solution to our financial difficulties. My mother's laugh was harsh and humorless. Do you think I have not explored every option? Do you think I would make such a decision lightly? The debts are too extensive, Aldwin. Your father was not wise in his final years. Without immediate relief, we will lose everything. But how would marrying a servant solve our financial problems? I asked, genuinely bewildered. For a long moment, my mother was silent. When she spoke, her voice was softer, almost contemplative. There are things about Celeste that you do not know. Things that even she does not fully understand. Trust me when I tell you that this marriage will secure our future. Before I could press her for more details, there was a soft knock at the breakfast room door. My mother straightened immediately, her expression becoming neutral and composed. Enter, she called. The door opened, and Celeste herself stepped quietly into the room. She carried a silver tray with fresh tea and warm scones, moving with the graceful efficiency I had observed countless times over the years. She kept her eyes properly downcast as she approached the table, but I found myself studying her face with new attention. She was 26 years old, I realized, no longer the skinny child who had arrived at our estate 2 decades ago. Her features had matured into something striking, though she clearly took pains to minimize her natural beauty. There was something in her bearing, too, a quiet dignity that seemed to transcend her station. "Thank you, Celeste," my mother said in her usual tone. "That will be all." But as Celeste turned to leave, I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "Wait." She paused, finally raising her eyes to meet mine. In that moment, I saw something I had never noticed before. There was intelligence there, yes, but also a kind of resigned sadness that struck me unexpectedly. She looked at me as if she already knew what was coming, as if she had been prepared for this moment. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. "About my mother's plans?" Celeste's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, my lord. Her ladyship spoke with me yesterday." "And what are your thoughts on the matter?" For a moment, she seemed to struggle with how to respond. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen. "It is not my place to have thoughts on such matters, my lord. I serve this family as I always have." But there was something in her eyes, a flash of what might have been pain or longing, that made me wonder if her composed response told the whole truth. As I looked at her standing there in her simple gray dress, her hands clasped quietly before her, I realized that I was seeing Celeste Thornwick clearly for perhaps the first time in 20 years. And I found myself wondering what other truths about her had been hidden in plain sight all along. That evening, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. I wandered the halls of Ravenshollow Manor like a restless spirit, my mind churning with questions I couldn't answer. The portraits of my ancestors seemed to watch me with disapproving eyes as I passed, their painted faces stern with the weight of centuries of tradition and expectation. I ended up in the library, hoping that the familiar comfort of books might calm my troubled thoughts. The room had always been my sanctuary, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves and the great fireplace that cast dancing shadows across the leather-bound volumes. But tonight, even this beloved space felt foreign and unsettling. As I pulled down a volume of poetry, trying to lose myself in familiar verses, I heard the soft sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Through the partially open door, I glimpsed Celeste moving quietly past, carrying an armload of freshly laundered linens. Something about her graceful movement, the way she seemed to glide rather than walk, made me set down my book and follow her. I kept my distance, not wanting to startle her, but curious about this woman who was apparently destined to become my wife. I watched as she climbed the servants' staircase to the upper floors, her movements economical and purposeful. She disappeared into what I knew to be my mother's chambers, and I found myself waiting in the shadows of the main staircase, feeling foolish but unable to leave. When she emerged 20 minutes later, she paused at the top of the stairs. In the dim candlelight from the wall sconces, I could see her face more clearly than I had that morning. There was something different about her expression when she thought no one was watching. The careful mask of servitude had slipped slightly, revealing a depth of emotion that surprised me. She looked tired, but it wasn't the simple fatigue of physical labor. There was something heavier in her features, a kind of emotional exhaustion that spoke of burdens I couldn't begin to understand. As she began to descend the stairs, she noticed my presence in the shadows below. "My lord," she said softly, inclining her head in the proper gesture of respect. "I didn't realize you were there." "I couldn't sleep," I replied, which was true enough. "The events of today have left me unsettled." She nodded, understanding immediately what I meant. "It is a significant change for all of us, my lord." I found myself stepping closer, drawn by something in her voice that I couldn't quite identify. "Celeste, may I ask you something?" "Of course, my lord." "Why did you agree to this arrangement? Surely you must have had reservations about marrying so far above your station." For a moment, she was quiet, her green eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My lord, I have served this family since I was 6 years old. This house, these people, you are all the family I have ever known. If I can be of service to you and to Lady Margaret in this way, then it is my honor to do so. But what about your own desires?" I pressed, surprising myself with the intensity of my question. "What about love, or dreams of your own choosing?" A shadow passed across her face, so quickly I might have imagined it. "People in my position do not have the luxury of such dreams, my lord. We find our contentment in duty and service." "That seems a very lonely way to live," I said, and immediately regretted the words. They seemed too intimate, too revealing of my own growing curiosity about her inner life. But instead of retreating behind formality, she looked directly at me for a moment, and I saw something raw and honest in her expression. "Perhaps, my lord. But loneliness is a small price to pay for security and belonging. I have never known any other life." As she spoke, I found myself remembering fragments of her history that I had never really considered before. She had arrived as a child, brought by someone whose face I couldn't recall. There had been talk among the servants about her parents being dead, but I had never paid attention to the details. She had simply always been there, a quiet presence in the background of my privileged life. "Celeste," I said carefully, "what happened to your family? How did you come to be here?" Her composure wavered slightly, and I saw her hands tighten on the bundle of linens she still carried. "I was orphaned very young, my lord. The details are unclear to me. Lady Margaret took me in out of Christian charity. I owe everything to her kindness." But there was something in the way she said it, a slight hesitation that made me wonder if there was more to the story than she was telling. Before I could pursue the question further, she continued. "If I may speak freely, my lord, I want you to know that I have no expectations of this marriage beyond what it can provide for your family's welfare. I understand my place, and I will not presume upon your kindness or seek more than is appropriate." The careful formality of her words stung more than I had expected. "And what if I told you that I would prefer a wife who might actually speak to me as an equal, rather than as a servant addressing her master?" This time, the surprise in her eyes was unmistakable. She stared at me for several seconds before responding. "I'm not sure I would know how to do that, my lord. It is not a skill I have ever had occasion to develop." "Perhaps," I said, feeling suddenly bold, "we might learn together." The suggestion hung in the air between us like something fragile and dangerous. I could see her considering it, weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, she nodded slowly. "If that is what you wish, my lord." "It is," I said firmly. "And please, when we are alone like this, you might try calling me Aldwin rather than my lord. We are to be husband and wife, after all." She tried the name tentatively, as if tasting something unfamiliar. Aldwyn. Then, with a small smile that transformed her entire face, she added, "It feels strange, but not unpleasant." That smile did something unexpected to me. For the first time since my mother's announcement that morning, I felt something other than dread about this impending marriage. There was intelligence in Celeste's eyes, and a kind of quiet strength that I found myself admiring. Perhaps this arrangement, however unconventional, might not be the disaster I had initially imagined. "Tell me," I said, emboldened by her smile, "what do you like to read? I noticed you had a book earlier this week when I passed through the kitchen garden." Her cheeks colored slightly, as if she had been caught in some minor transgression. "I hope I wasn't neglecting my duties, my Aldwyn. I try to read only during my free time." "That wasn't my concern," I assured her quickly. "I was simply curious about your interests." "I enjoy poetry," she admitted. "And sometimes history. Lady Margaret has been kind enough to allow me access to some of the books in the library when they are not needed elsewhere." "What kind of poetry?" Her expression grew more animated, and I realized this was the first time I had seen her speak about something that genuinely interested her. "I particularly admire the sonnets. There's something about the structure, the way complex emotions can be contained within such precise boundaries. It seems almost miraculous." I found myself genuinely surprised by the sophistication of her response. This was not the sort of literary discussion I would have expected from a maid, however intelligent. "Have you read Shakespeare's sonnets?" "Oh yes," she said, and for a moment her formal demeanor disappeared entirely. "Though I think I prefer some of the newer poets. There's something about the older language that sometimes feels distant." We talked for nearly an hour, standing there in the candlelit corridor, and I discovered that Celeste Thornwick was unlike anyone I had ever encountered. She was educated far beyond what her station should have allowed, with opinions and insights that challenged my assumptions about class and intelligence. More than that, she had a way of listening that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't experienced before. When she finally excused herself to complete her evening duties, I found myself watching her disappear down the corridor with something that might have been regret. For the first time in my life, I had spoken with a woman as an intellectual equal, and the experience had been both exhilarating and unsettling. As I returned to my own chambers that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to Celeste Thornwick than anyone suspected. The first snows of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the Yorkshire countryside in pristine white. It had been 3 weeks since my mother's announcement, and the marriage banns had been read twice in the village church. The scandal had spread like wildfire through our small community and beyond, reaching even the drawing rooms of London society. I was acutely aware of the whispers that followed me wherever I went. The postman delivered letters daily, some expressing shock, others barely concealed disgust from family friends who couldn't fathom how the Earl of Ravenshollow could stoop to marry a servant. The local gentry had begun declining our invitations, and I noticed how conversation ceased abruptly when I entered rooms. But it was Celeste who bore the worst of it. I watched from my study window one morning as she returned from the village market, her face pale and her usual composed demeanor strained. Agnes, our elderly cook who had practically raised Celeste from childhood, intercepted her at the kitchen door with worried questions. Later that day, I found Celeste in the herb garden behind the house, sitting on a stone bench with her face buried in her hands. The sight of her obvious distress stirred something protective in me that I hadn't expected to feel. "Celeste," I said gently, approaching slowly so as not to startle her. "What happened in the village?" She looked up quickly, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Nothing that matters, Aldwyn. People talk. It will pass." "Tell me," I insisted, sitting beside her on the cold stone bench. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the snow-covered garden. Finally, she spoke in a voice so low I had to lean closer to hear her. "Mrs. Pemberton was at the baker's shop when I arrived. She made certain everyone could hear her opinions about servants who get above their station. She suggested that I had used improper means to secure your affections. The fury that rose in me was swift and hot. She said what? It doesn't matter, Celeste said quickly. She's entitled to her opinions. No, I said firmly, she is not entitled to slander you publicly. I'll speak to her husband immediately. Please don't. Her hand touched my arm briefly, and I felt the warmth of it even through my coat sleeve. It will only make things worse. People will say I've turned you against your own class, that I'm manipulating you. There's already talk that I've somehow bewitched you into this marriage. The irony of her words struck me forcefully. If anyone was being manipulated, it was both of us, caught in whatever scheme my mother had devised. But as I looked at Celeste sitting there in the winter garden, her cheeks reddened by cold and distress, I realized that my feelings toward her had grown more complicated than I cared to examine. What if they're right? I found myself saying. What if you have bewitched me? She turned to look at me with surprise, and I saw something flicker in her green eyes that might have been hope before she quickly suppressed it. Don't say such things, even in jest. Someone might hear. I'm not jesting, I said, surprised by my own honesty. These past weeks, getting to know you, talking with you. I've found myself looking forward to our conversations in a way that I never expected. Her breath caught slightly, visible in the cold air. Aldwin, you don't understand. This marriage, it isn't what you think it is. What do you mean? She stood abruptly, wrapping her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. I mean that you're being kind to me because you're a good man, but kindness isn't love. You shouldn't mistake duty for affection. And what if it's you who's mistaken? I challenged, standing to face her. What if what I'm feeling is neither duty nor mere kindness? For a moment, she looked as if she might speak the truth of her own feelings. But then her careful mask slipped back into place, and she stepped away from me. It wouldn't matter if it were, my lord. Some boundaries cannot be crossed, no matter what we might wish. The formality of my lord after weeks of using my given name felt like a deliberate distance, and it stung more than I cared to admit. But before I could respond, we were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A fine carriage was pulling up the drive, bearing the distinctive crest of the Pemberton family. My stomach sank as I recognized the significance. Lord Pemberton himself was paying us a call, and I doubted it was a social visit. Go inside, I told Celeste quietly. I'll handle whatever this is. But she shook her head, her chin lifting with a stubborn determination I was beginning to recognize. No. If this concerns our marriage, then I have a right to hear what's said. Lord Pemberton was a large man with florid cheeks and an air of self-importance that had always irritated me, even in our previous cordial interactions. He strode into our drawing room without waiting for proper invitation, his face dark with anger. Raven's Hollow, he said without preamble, this madness has gone far enough. I'm here to discuss your obligations to my family. My mother appeared from the doorway, having obviously been expecting this confrontation. Lord Pemberton, she said coolly, how unexpected. Though I suppose we should have anticipated your visit. Don't play innocent with me, Margaret, Pemberton snapped, his usual veneer of politeness completely abandoned. You know perfectly well that your son was expected to marry my daughter. The understanding between our families goes back years. Understanding, yes, my mother replied calmly. But no formal contract was ever signed. Because we trusted in your word as a gentleman's family. Pemberton's voice rose dangerously. My daughter has been preparing for this marriage since she was 16. She has turned down other eligible suitors because of your assurances. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on my shoulders. Lord Pemberton, I regret any misunderstanding, but I never made any formal commitment to your daughter. If my family led you to believe otherwise, then I apologize for the confusion. Confusion? Pemberton's face was turning an alarming shade of purple. You call ruining my daughter's reputation a confusion? Do you have any idea what this humiliation has cost her? What it has cost me? I'm truly sorry for any pain this has caused, I said, and I meant it. But surely your daughter is better served by marrying a man who can offer her genuine affection rather than one bound by obligation. Affection? Pemberton spat. You speak to me of affection when you're planning to marry a kitchen maid? Have you lost your mind entirely? I felt Celeste flinch beside me, and my protective instincts flared again. You will speak respectfully of my intended wife, or you will leave this house immediately. Your intended wife? Pemberton laughed harshly. That creature is no more your wife than my horse is. She's a servant who has somehow convinced you to make a fool of yourself and disgrace your family name. That's enough, I said sharply, stepping forward. But Pemberton wasn't finished. He turned his attention to Celeste, looking her up and down with obvious disdain. What did you promise him, girl? What lies did you tell to secure this impossible elevation? Celeste raised her chin, meeting his hostile gaze with quiet dignity. I promised nothing, my lord. I asked for nothing. This arrangement was made by others, not by me. Arrangement? Pemberton seized on the word. So you admit this is some sort of scheme? Some plot to extract money from a grieving family? That's when my mother spoke, her voice cutting through the heated exchange like a blade. The only scheme here, William, is yours. Did you think I didn't know about the debts? Did you imagine I was unaware that your offer for my son came with conditions that would have bankrupted us within a year? Pemberton's face went pale. What are you talking about? The loans you were prepared to offer, my mother continued relentlessly, at terms so usurious they would have made us little more than your indentured servants. The business partnerships that would have given you control of our estate within 5 years. Did you really think me so naive? The silence that followed was deafening. I looked between my mother and Lord Pemberton, beginning to understand that there were layers to this situation that I had never suspected. But it was Celeste's expression that caught my attention most forcefully. She was staring at my mother with something that looked like recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. You have no proof of any such thing, Pemberton said finally, but his bluster had lost its force. Don't I? My mother smiled coldly. Perhaps you should speak to your man of business. I believe he has been less discreet than you might have hoped. Pemberton stared at her for a long moment, then turned his furious gaze back to me. This isn't over, Ravens Hollow. You'll regret this decision. Both of you will. As his carriage disappeared down the drive, I found myself looking at my mother with new eyes. There was clearly much more to her motivations than simple financial desperation. But when I turned to share this realization with Celeste, I discovered she had disappeared, leaving only questions and the lingering scent of lavender in the winter air. I found Celeste in her small chamber in the servants' quarters an hour later, packing her few belongings into a worn leather trunk. The sight stopped me cold in the doorway, and for a moment I couldn't find my voice. What are you doing? I finally managed to ask. She didn't look up from folding a simple brown dress. What I should have done weeks ago. I'm leaving, Aldwin. Leaving? The word came out sharper than I intended. Where would you go? That's not your concern anymore. Her voice was steady, but I could see the tremor in her hands as she continued packing. I should never have agreed to this arrangement. It was selfish and foolish. I stepped into the small room, noting for the first time how sparse her accommodations were. A narrow bed, a single wooden chair, a small table with a basin for washing. The only personal items I could see were a handful of books stacked carefully on the windowsill and a small wooden box that looked very old. Celeste, you can't simply leave. The banns have been read. The arrangements are made. She finally turned to face me, and I was shocked by the pain I saw in her eyes. Don't you understand? Lord Pemberton was right about one thing. This marriage would ruin you socially. Your children would carry the stigma of their mother's low birth for generations. I won't be responsible for that. That's not your decision to make, I said firmly. Besides, do you really think I care what Lord Pemberton or his ilk think about my choices? You should care, she replied, closing the trunk with more force than necessary. You're an earl, Aldwyn. You have responsibilities to your name, to your future children. I'm just a maid who learned to read and got ideas above her station. The bitterness in her voice caught me off guard. Is that truly what you think of yourself? She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the closed trunk as if it represented all the decisions she had ever made. It's what I am. What I've always been. No, I said, moving closer. It's not. I've spent weeks getting to know you, Celeste. You're intelligent, educated, articulate. You discuss literature and philosophy as if you were born to it. You carry yourself with a dignity that half the noblewomen in London couldn't match. There's something about you that doesn't fit with the story of an orphaned kitchen maid. Something flickered across her face at my words, but she quickly suppressed it. Pretty words don't change facts, Aldwyn. I have no family, no dowry, no connections. I have nothing to bring to a marriage except scandal. You have yourself, I said quietly. And I've discovered that might be enough. She stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something like hope war with resignation in her expression. You don't mean that. Don't I? I took another step closer, close enough now to see the gold flecks in her green eyes. What if I told you that these past weeks have been the most interesting of my life? What if I said that I look forward to our conversations more than anything else in my day? Aldwyn, please don't. Her voice was barely a whisper. Don't make this harder than it has to be. What if I told you that somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as an obligation and started hoping it might become something real? She closed her eyes tightly, as if my words caused her physical pain. You can't say such things. Why not, if they're true? Because they're not. The words burst out of her with surprising force. You think you know me, but you don't. You don't know anything about me, about where I came from, about why I'm really here. Then tell me, I challenged. Help me understand. For a moment, I thought she might. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then she shook her head decisively. It doesn't matter. Nothing changes the fact that this marriage is impossible. My mother doesn't seem to think so. Your mother has her reasons, Celeste said with a strange emphasis that made me wonder what she knew that I didn't. But those reasons aren't love, and they aren't what's best for you. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door frame. We both turned to see Agnes standing there, her weathered face creased with worry. Begging your pardon, my lord, the old cook said, but Lady Margaret is asking for you both in the drawing room. Says it's urgent. Celeste and I exchanged glances, and I could see her reluctance to face whatever new crisis awaited us. But we followed Agnes through the winding corridors to the main part of the house, where we found my mother standing before the fireplace with a leather portfolio in her hands. Sit down, both of you, she said without preamble. It's time you knew the truth. Celeste sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her, and I noticed that her face had gone pale. Whatever my mother was about to reveal, Celeste had some idea of what it might be. 20 years ago, my mother began, a dear friend of mine died in childbed, leaving behind a 6-year-old daughter. The child's father had died in a hunting accident the year before, and there were no other relatives willing to take responsibility for her care. I felt a chill of premonition, but my mother continued relentlessly. This friend had made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would see that her daughter was cared for and protected. The child had a substantial inheritance, but there were those who would have seen her dead rather than allow her to claim it. So I brought her here, gave her a new identity, and raised her as a member of our household staff. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at Celeste, who was staring at her hands folded in her lap, her whole body rigid with tension. Celeste, my mother said gently, is not the orphan child of unknown parentage that she believes herself to be. She is Celeste Thornwick, daughter of the late Duke of Thornwick, and the rightful heir to one of the largest fortunes in England. The words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the room. I stared at Celeste, trying to process what I had just heard. A duke's daughter. Hidden in plain sight for 20 years. That's impossible, I said finally. Is it? My mother opened the leather portfolio and withdrew several documents. Here is her birth certificate, bearing the seal of the Duke of Thornwick. Here are the legal papers establishing her inheritance, held in trust until her 25th birthday. And here, she held up a small oil painting, is a portrait of her mother, painted just before her marriage. I looked at the miniature portrait and felt my breath catch. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same auburn hair, the same green eyes, the same delicate features that had made me think Celeste beautiful despite her efforts to hide it. Why? Celeste's voice was barely audible. Why didn't you tell me? Because you were safer not knowing, my mother replied. Your father's cousin, who inherited the duchy, spent years searching for you. He knew that if you lived to claim your inheritance, his own position would be threatened. It wasn't until last year, when he died without male heirs, that it became safe for you to reclaim your identity. So the marriage, I said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, wasn't about solving our financial problems. It was about protecting Celeste while she transitioned back to her rightful place in society. Partly, my mother admitted. But also because I have watched you both these past years. I have seen how you look at her when you think no one notices, Aldwin. And I have seen how she looks at you. Some matches are made by lawyers and accountants. Others are written in the heart long before the mind recognizes them. I turned to Celeste, who was still staring at the documents as if they might disappear if she looked away. Did you know? I suspected, she whispered. There were always things that didn't quite fit. Memories from early childhood that didn't match the story I was told. Dreams about places I had never seen but somehow knew. But I never imagined. She looked up at me with eyes bright with unshed tears. A duke's daughter, Aldwin. Do you understand what this means? It means, I said, rising from my chair and extending my hand to her, that instead of being accused of marrying beneath my station, I'll be congratulated on securing one of the most advantageous matches of the season. She stared at my outstretched hand as if it were a bridge across an impossible chasm. Everything has changed. Has it? I asked softly. You're still the woman who discusses poetry with me in darkened corridors. You're still the person whose intelligence and kindness have captured my admiration. You're still Celeste. Slowly, tentatively, she placed her hand in mine. But now I'm Celeste Thornwick, daughter of a duke, with wealth and position and expectations I know nothing about. Then we'll learn together, I said, drawing her to her feet. Just as we planned. For the first time since my mother's revelation, she smiled. It was a small, uncertain smile, but it was genuine. Do you really mean that? I mean, I said, raising her hand to my lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, that I've discovered I'm in love with you, regardless of your birth or fortune. And I hope you might find it possible to love me in return. The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, but now they seemed to be tears of joy rather than sorrow. I've loved you for years, Aldwin. Even when I thought it was hopeless, even when I knew it was impossible. I've loved you since I was old enough to understand what love meant. As I drew her into my arms for the first time, I realized that my mother had been right about more than just Celeste's identity. Some matches truly are written in the heart long before the mind has sense enough to recognize them. The transformation that followed was remarkable to witness. Within days of my mother's revelation, letters began arriving from London bearing the seals of the most prominent families in England. Word had spread quickly through society that the lost heiress of Thornwick had been found, and suddenly our unconventional engagement was being hailed as a romantic triumph rather than a social scandal. Celeste handled the sudden change in her circumstances with a grace that shouldn't have surprised me but somehow did. She met with the lawyers who had been managing her inheritance, studied the estate records with the same careful attention she had once given to household accounts, and gradually began to remember fragments of her early childhood that had been buried for 20 years. But it was the small, private moments that meant the most to me. The way she still moved through the house with the same quiet consideration for others. The way she continued to check on Agnes in the kitchen and ensure that the younger servants were treated fairly. The way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, as if she still couldn't quite believe that all of this was real. Our wedding took place on a clear winter morning in February, in the small village church where the banns had been read amid such controversy just months before. The same villagers who had whispered scandal now lined the streets to catch a glimpse of their local duchess, and I noticed more than a few sheepish expressions among those who had spoken harshly of her just weeks earlier. Celeste looked radiant in a gown of ivory silk that had been hastily commissioned from London, her auburn hair crowned with the Thornwick tiara that had been retrieved from the family vault. But it wasn't the finery that took my breath away as she walked down the aisle toward me. It was the look in her eyes, the quiet joy and wonder that spoke of dreams she had never dared to dream coming true. As we exchanged vows, I found myself thinking of all the years we had lived in the same house, passing in corridors and sharing brief, formal exchanges, never knowing that fate was slowly weaving our lives together. The vicar pronounced us husband and wife, and when I kissed her for the first time as my duchess, I tasted salt and realized she was crying. Happy tears? I whispered against her lips. The happiest, she whispered back. The wedding breakfast was a more elaborate affair than originally planned, with guests who had traveled from London specifically to meet the newly revealed Duchess of Ravenshollow. I watched Celeste navigate the social complexities with remarkable skill, displaying the natural dignity that had always been part of her character but which now made perfect sense given her true heritage. Lord Pemberton attended, his manner stiffly correct but no longer openly hostile. His daughter, I was relieved to learn, had recently become engaged to a young baron who seemed genuinely smitten with her. The crisis we had all imagined had resolved itself more easily than anyone had dared to hope. But it was during the dancing that evening that I truly understood how completely my life had changed. As I held Celeste in my arms for our first waltz as husband and wife, I marveled at how perfectly she fit against me, how naturally we moved together despite having never danced together before. "Do you remember learning to dance?" I asked as we turned in time to the music. She smiled up at me, her green eyes sparkling in the candlelight. "I do, actually. It's one of the memories that came back. My mother teaching me the steps in the drawing room of our old house. I was perhaps 4 years old, and I kept stepping on her toes. And now you're dancing with an earl," I said, spinning her gently. "I'm dancing with my husband," she corrected softly. "The earl part is just an interesting detail." As the evening wound down and our guests began to take their leave, my mother approached us with something I had never seen in her expression before, complete contentment. "I have something for you," she told Celeste, holding out a small wooden box that I recognized from Celeste's former chamber. Celeste took the box with gentle hands, running her fingers over the worn wood. "I always wondered about this. It was the only thing I had when I arrived here." "Open it," my mother urged. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a delicate gold locket and a folded piece of paper. Celeste lifted out the locket first, opening it to reveal tiny portraits of a man and woman I didn't recognize. "Your parents," my mother said quietly. "And the paper is a letter your mother wrote to you just before you were born. I thought you should have them both now." Celeste's hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, scanning the faded ink. Whatever she read there brought fresh tears to her eyes, but when she looked up at my mother, her expression was radiant. "She loved me," she said simply. "She says she loved me more than life itself, and that she hoped I would grow up to be brave and kind and true to my own heart. She would be very proud, my mother said, embracing her gently. And she would be delighted to know that you found love with someone who sees your true worth. Later that night, as we settled into the chambers that had been prepared for us as a married couple, I found Celeste sitting by the window, still wearing her wedding gown but with her hair loose around her shoulders. She was looking out at the snow-covered gardens where we had shared so many conversations over the past months. "Do you ever wonder how different things might have been?" she asked as I joined her by the window. "Different how?" "If your mother had told me the truth years ago. If I had grown up knowing who I was, been educated as a duke's daughter, made my debut in London society." She paused, turning to look at me. "Would you have noticed me then? Would you have chosen me among all the other eligible young ladies?" I considered the question seriously, thinking about the man I had been before this strange courtship began. "I don't know," I admitted. "The man I was 6 months ago might have been too concerned with propriety and expectation to look beyond the surface. But I like to think that your intelligence and kindness would have shone through regardless of the circumstances. And I wonder," she continued, "if I would have had the strength to choose love over advantage, if I had been raised with different expectations. What do you think?" She smiled, leaning into my embrace. "I think that some things are meant to be, regardless of the path that leads us there. I think that 20 years of watching you grow from boy to man, of learning your character through small daily observations, gave me a foundation for love that no London season could have provided." "So you're glad things happened as they did?" "I'm glad," she said firmly, "that I was allowed to fall in love with your heart before I knew about your title. And I'm grateful that you fell in love with mine before you knew about my fortune. Everything else is just details." As I held my wife in the quiet of our wedding night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. What had begun as a shocking command from my mother had become the greatest gift of my life. I had gained not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who understood duty and service but also knew how to choose love when it mattered most. Years later, when people asked about our unusual courtship, I would tell them that sometimes the best things in life are hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for us to develop the wisdom to recognize them. Love, I learned, is not always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it grows quietly in the spaces between duty and desire, nurtured by respect and conversation and the gradual recognition that you have found someone who sees the world through eyes remarkably similar to your own. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that love is returned by someone who has been waiting 20 years for you to notice that they were there all along. If this story has touched your heart, I hope you'll subscribe to hear more tales of love that conquers all odds, because I've learned that the greatest love stories are often the ones that unfold slowly, hidden in the ordinary moments of life, until suddenly they bloom into something extraordinary that changes everything.